He could have kept his license. All Davin Okafor had to do was countersign one equipment inspection report, a routine sign-off on a hydraulic press line that he had personally flagged as unsafe 3 weeks earlier. He refused. 9 days later, a man named Garrett Sims lost 2 fingers and most of the feeling in his right hand on that press. 4 days after that, Davin walked out of Reinhold Manufacturing in Brantford, Ontario, with a cardboard box and a termination letter that used the words performance concerns and meant something else entirely. He drove home in the February sleet to a house that had 1 child's bedroom, 1 bathroom, a kitchen, with a dripping tap he had been meaning to fix since September, and a voicemail from a woman at the Children's Aid Society of Brant County, who said she needed to speak with him when he had a moment, that it concerned the children of Garrett Sims. Davin did not have a moment. He called her back in the parking lot of the plant with the engine still running and the defroster blowing hot air across the windshield. Garrett's wife had left 3 years earlier. There were 2 kids, a boy named Eli who was 9 and a girl named Saren who was 6. Garrett was in surgery at Brantford General and would be for several more hours. And once he was out, he would not be able to care for 2 children in the short term, possibly the medium term, and possibly longer depending on his recovery. The woman from the society, her name was Heather Pauls, said Davin's name had appeared on Garrett's emergency contact form, the one he had filled out in his first week at Reinhold 3 years ago. She asked if Davin was in a position to take the children temporarily while Garrett was in hospital. Davin looked at the parking lot through the fogged glass. He said yes. He got the kids at 4 in the afternoon. Eli came through the front door of the society's office with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at the floor. Saren came out behind him, holding a pillowcase with both hands that had her stuffed fox and 1 library book and a small pink hairbrush inside it. When Davin crouched down to her level, she studied him with the serious attention of a person who needed to be certain before committing to anything. Then she said very carefully, "My dad says you're the only honest man at work." Davin did not say anything for a moment. He picked up the pillowcase. He said they were going to stop for groceries on the way home and she could pick out 1 thing for dinner. She picked macaroni. Eli picked nothing and said he wasn't hungry and ate 2 bowls anyway. That first night, Davin put Saren in his bed and Eli on the couch with a sleeping bag and extra pillows from the closet shelf. He sat at the kitchen table after they were asleep and looked at his phone. His savings account had $2,340 in it. His truck payment was due in 11 days. He was 41 years old, and he had been employed continuously for 17 years. He opened his notebook and wrote down the names of every person he knew in Brantford who might hire a licensed millwright on short notice, a machine shop on Colborne Street, an HVAC contractor he had done a weekend job for in 2019, a retired electrician named Barry who did renovations and always needed an extra pair of hands. In the morning, he made scrambled eggs and toast. Saren ate everything. Eli ate half and pushed the rest around his plate and then asked if his dad was going to be okay. Davin told him the truth, which was that he didn't know all the details yet, but that he was going to find out that day, and that he would tell Eli everything he found out. Eli nodded once, the way a child nods when he is deciding whether to believe something. Then he picked up his fork and ate the rest of the eggs. Garrett's recovery took longer than anyone had said at the beginning. The hand healed, but the nerve damage was permanent. He could not grip, could not lift. He lost his job at the plant within 60 days. They used a different phrase than they had used for Davin, but it meant the same thing. He moved into an assisted living arrangement through a program Heather Pauls had helped him find, and he called the kids every Sunday, and Davin drove them to see him every other Saturday, and Garrett would sit with them on a bench in the courtyard, and Saren would tell him about school. And Eli would sit close enough that their shoulders were touching and would not say much and did not need to. The temporary arrangement became a longer one. Then it became simply the arrangement, the one nobody discussed renegotiating because the kids were doing all right, and Garrett was not in a position to change it, and there was no one else. Davin took work where he found it, the machine shop, the HVAC contractor, Barry, and his renovations. He started doing equipment repair out of the garage, lathes, air compressors, industrial pumps. Word moved through trades the way it always did, slowly and by reputation, and within 2 years he had more work than he had time. He did not hire anyone. He could not afford to take that risk. He worked from 6 in the morning until Eli needed to be picked up from school, and then he made dinner and helped with homework and went back out to the garage at 8, after the kids were down. He did it 6 days a week and took Sundays partly off, because Garrett called at noon. He did not think of it as sacrifice. He thought of it as the shape of things. Saren turned 7, then 8. She began leaving drawings on the workbench in the garage. Crayon portraits of machines she did not know the names of, which Davin taped to the pegboard above the bench where the calipers hung. Eli joined a hockey league and was unremarkable at it and loved it entirely, and Davin drove him to 6 a.m. practice on Saturday mornings in the truck, with the heat turned all the way up and a thermos of coffee in the cup holder. Reinhold Manufacturing continued operating. The press line was taken out of service for 11 weeks following Garrett's accident, and then quietly put back in. No charges were filed. The OHSA inspector's report cited inadequate operator training. Davin's name did not appear in the report. He did not sue. He had spoken with a lawyer in Brantford who had told him plainly that the case was winnable in principle and expensive in practice and long in duration, and that the company had retained a firm out of Toronto that had been doing this particular kind of work for 30 years. He thought about it for 3 days, and then thought about Eli's practice schedule and Saren's school calendar, and he put the lawyer's card in a kitchen drawer and did not call back. The drawer had 2 other things in it: a takeout menu for a Thai place that had since closed and a photograph of himself and Garrett from a company barbecue in 2021, both of them squinting into the sun. Reinhold went on. Davin went on. The years did what years do. 18 years later, a woman named Vivian Katos sat in the back of a rideshare on the 403 heading into Hamilton and read the acquisition brief on her laptop for the second time in 2 days. She was 38, a partner at Arcourt & Neal in Toronto, and she had been brought in to represent the acquiring party in what the brief described as a mid-size industrial buyout. The seller was Reinhold Manufacturing, a hydraulics and safety equipment company based in Brantford, currently owned and operated by a man named Douglas Reinhold, second generation, who had inherited the company from his father in 2008 and had been trying to sell it for the better part of 3 years. The buyer was a company called Sims Industrial Partners. Vivian had done a standard conflict check and found nothing. She had read the company filings and found 2 principals: Eli Sims, listed as Chief Executive, age 27, and Saren Sims, listed as Chief Operating Officer, age 24. Their registered address was a commercial unit in Brantford. Their financing had cleared through a mid-size bank in Waterloo. The deal was clean and the price was fair, and the timeline was short: 8 weeks to close. She met the 2 principals for the first time on a Tuesday morning in a boardroom at a law office on King Street West in Hamilton. Eli came in wearing a dark gray suit, no tie, and shook hands with everyone at the table before sitting down. Saren came in behind him with a leather folio and positioned herself at the whiteboard before anyone had asked her to do so. She was the smaller of the 2, by about 4 inches, and moved through the room with the assurance of someone who had already decided how the meeting was going to end. Saren opened with the financial terms and walked through them without answering the 3 questions from Reinhold's counsel before they had finished asking them. Eli handled the operational timeline. They did not look at each other much. They did not need to. At the end of the meeting, as the Reinhold side was gathering papers, Eli said very casually that the final contract would include a non-financial clause, and that his team would send the language within the week. Douglas Reinhold asked what kind of clause. Eli looked at him pleasantly. "You'll see when you see it." Vivienne drove back to Toronto on the 403 in the opposite direction, and spent that evening reading everything she could find about Sims Industrial Partners that had not been in the brief. The company was 8 years old. It had been founded by Eli Sims and Saren Sims, both of whom had grown up in Brantford. Their father, Garrett Sims, had worked at Reinhold Manufacturing from 2019 to 2022. He was listed in a 2022 WSIB settlement as the injured party in a workplace incident involving a hydraulic press. The settlement amount was sealed. She kept reading. The emergency contact listed in every document filed by both Eli and Saren through their teenage years: school records, medical files, youth hockey registration, a public library card renewal from 2012, was a man named Davin Okafor. His address, a house on Elgin Street in Brantford. She pulled up the OHSA regional database in a new window. She typed the name. A reference came back in an archived 2004 inspection addendum, filed as a dissent to the primary inspection finding. The signature of an engineer who had submitted a formal refusal to certify a hydraulic line as safe. The name was Davin Okafor. The submission was dated 9 days before the incident that eventually took Garrett Sims's hand. She sat with that for a while. There was one more thing. She found it in the Brantford Expositor's digital archive, an article from February 2007, 3 paragraphs, buried in the business section. The headline was, "Local Millwrights Safety Concerns Preceded Sims Incident, Records Show." The article had been filed 2.5 years after the fact. It named no sources. The byline was a reporter named Duncan Chow. It had 6 reader comments, most of them expressing surprise that nothing had come of the story. Nothing had come of it. She closed the laptop. She looked out the window of her office at the lights of the lake. She did not feel good about where she was sitting. In the morning she called her assistant and cleared Thursday afternoon. She drove to Brantford. She had Davin Okafor's address from the archived records, and she found the house without difficulty. A narrow 2-story on Elgin Street, painted the gray-green of old cedar, with a front porch and a concrete pad beside the house where a truck was parked. From the laneway she could hear the steady sound of machinery. She walked around the side of the house. A man in a canvas work shirt was at a bench press, doing a calibration check on something that looked like an industrial valve assembly. It was tall and broad-shouldered with close-cropped hair going silver at the sides. He looked up when he heard her footsteps on the gravel. She introduced herself. She said the name of her firm. She said she was the legal counsel for the buyer in the acquisition of Reinhold Manufacturing. He set down the calibration tool and wiped his hands on a rag. He did not extend one to shake. He said, "I had a feeling someone would come up here eventually." She asked if he knew that the children of Garrett Sims were the ones buying Reinhold. He said, "I know they've been building something for a while. I haven't asked the specifics. They've got their own reasons for what they do. I've never wanted my situation to be their situation." She looked around the garage. The tools were arranged with the precision of someone who had been organizing them the same way for a very long time. Drill press, tap and die set, a row of measuring instruments on a magnetic strip above the bench. On the wall to the left, pinned with a single tack, was a photocopy of an inspection form. The checkbox marked "Safe to Operate" was empty. The date was February 2006. Across the bottom, "Refused D. Okafor." He offered her coffee. She said yes. The kitchen was small and clean in the way that the kitchen of a person who lives alone and is careful about it is always clean. One drip machine, a rack of mugs on a peg. On the windowsill above the sink, a wooden shelf held a framed photograph. Davin and 2 young people. A young man in hockey gear holding a trophy and a young woman in a university graduation gown. All 3 of them blinking into sunlight outside a building Vivian did not recognize. No plaques, no commendations, no certification frames on the wall. She asked him, while the coffee dripped, what he had done after he was let go. He said he had started calling the people he knew and doing the work that was available. He said the first job he had done as an independent was servicing a compressor for a bakery on Colborne Street, and they had paid him partly in bread for the first month because they were a small operation and the timing was bad. He said it had been fine. He said it had been, looking back, exactly the kind of work he was suited to. He answered her questions in the same short, patient way. He did not know what the non-financial clause said. He did not know the deal size. He had not looked up Sims Industrial Partners in any formal way. He said only that Eli had been a very serious child who asked practical questions, and Saren had been a child who drew pictures of things she did not yet have words for, and that both of them had turned out exactly as he would have expected, which he said not as a compliment to himself but as a simple statement of observation. She drove back to Toronto in the early evening. On the stretch of highway past Paris, she said out loud, to no one in particular, "What exactly am I doing here and for whom?" She did not have an answer. She had a client who had paid a retainer and a file that was clean and a deal that was on schedule. She also had a photocopy of a refused inspection form, dated 9 days before a man lost the permanent use of his right hand, and she had known since her second year of practice what it meant when a company's legal team described that kind of timing as a coincidence. She opened the OHSA inspection file, from 2007 in her office the following morning and read it through twice. The formal finding had been inadequate operator training. The signatory for Reinhold on the OSA settlement correspondence was a woman named Paulette Reinhold, Douglas's mother, who had been running the company's legal affairs informally at the time. She had died in 2015. The law firm she had retained in 2007 was still operating. Vivian knew two of the partners. She drove back to Brantford on a Thursday, and this time she brought the file in a portfolio. Davin was at the outdoor spigot rinsing his hands when she came up the laneway. He had been doing a brake job on a neighbor's equipment. They sat on the porch in two metal chairs and she put the portfolio on the small table between them. He read through it without expression, the same way she imagined had read it in his own head many times over many years. When he was done, he stacked the pages neatly and handed the portfolio back. She asked him why he had not pursued a formal claim. He was quiet for a moment. He looked down the street. A pair of children were on bikes at the far end. I had two kids in the house who needed to get up in the morning, he said. If I went to court, I was going into something that would take years and cost money I didn't have on a case against a company that had 30 years of practice defending itself. I made the calculation. I chose the mornings. He picked up his coffee mug. And I wasn't wrong about how it would have gone. Brantford in 2007 was a town where the Reinholds had been around since before I was born. She asked if there was anyone still at the company, or who had been there in those years, who might have information about what the internal review had actually found. He thought about it. He said there had been a plant safety coordinator named Wendy Sharp, who had been with Reinhold from the late 90s till she retired. He said she had been in the room for several things that had mattered. He thought she had moved to Ancaster. He was not sure she had ever been asked to speak about any of it. Vivienne wrote the name in her notebook. She found Wendy Sharp through a retired trades association directory. She called ahead. Wendy said she had signed a confidentiality agreement, and she was not in the habit of breaking things she had signed. She said this firmly and then did not hang up. Vivienne drove to Ancaster on a rainy Friday morning. The house was on a quiet street of brick bungalows near the escarpment. She knocked, and the door opened. Wendy Sharp was a short woman in her late 60s with steel-gray hair and the flat, measuring look of someone who had spent a long career in rooms where she had been the only person taking notes. She looked at Vivian's card through the storm door for a very long time. "I'm not breaking what I signed," she said. "I want to be clear about that." She opened the door. The living room had a bookcase that ran the full length of one wall. There were no family photographs anywhere. On the coffee table there was already a pot of tea set out, which told Vivian something about how the call had landed on Wendy's end. Wendy poured without asking. She stood near the window and did not sit. "There was an internal incident report," she said, after a very long silence, "filed within 72 hours of Garrett Sims's accident. Not the one that went to OSA, a separate one. Internal." I typed it. "The finding in that report was not operator error." She stopped. The finding was an unresolved design flaw in the secondary pressure coupling on the press line. The same flaw that had been flagged in a refusal to certify filed 9 days before the incident by the millwright they let go. She walked to a cabinet in the hallway. She came back with a standard manila envelope. She set it on the table between the teapot and the mugs. "I'm 67 years old," she said. "I kept that because I needed leverage. I'm keeping my NDA. I'm not handing you a weapon. But if someone were to file a request, under the right provision of the Occupational Health and Safety Act for internal records pertaining to a formal WSIB settlement matter, and if the company were no longer privately held and therefore subject to different disclosure obligations, under new corporate ownership, then whatever was in their records room would not be my responsibility anymore." She paused. "That is not legal advice. That is me telling you something true." Vivienne picked up the envelope. She looked at it. She set it back down. She drove east toward Hamilton on the way back to the 403. She stopped at a Tim Hortons near the edge of Ancaster and sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes. She thought about a case she had worked on as a junior associate, years ago, a foundry worker in Sault Ste. Marie who had filed a refusal to operate faulty equipment and been terminated, and had come to the firm looking for representation and had been assessed by the senior partner as not economically viable, which was a phrase they used then. The man had eventually found another lawyer. He had not won, She had thought about him at irregular intervals ever since, most recently about 3 days ago. She called Eli Sims from the parking lot. She said, "I need to see the non-financial clause, tonight if possible." The office of Sims Industrial Partners was on the second floor of a commercial building, on Dalhousie Street in Brantford. The windows looked out over the Grand River. The light was going gold and flat over the water when Vivienne arrived. Eli and Saren were both there. The office was neat and spare, 2 desks pushed to opposite walls, a long work table in the middle, with documents laid out in order, a single frame on the wall that held a photograph, 2 children in winter coats, and a younger David Okafor between them, all 3 of them standing outside what looked like a hockey arena. In the early morning, their breath visible in the cold air. Saren slid a single sheet across the work table without preamble. 3 numbered items, typed cleanly. 1. Reinhold Manufacturing, under new ownership, shall issue a formal public statement on corporate letterhead, acknowledging that the incident of February 14, 2007 was preceded by an internal safety refusal filed by a licensed millwright. The statement shall specifically name Davon Okafor and acknowledge his professional conduct. 2. The incoming ownership shall commission an independent engineering review of all active press lines at the Brantford facility and shall publish the findings regardless of outcome. 3. A personal letter of acknowledgement, signed by Douglas Reinhold, shall be delivered to Davon Okafor at his home address. It shall use the words "we were wrong" in the first paragraph. Vivienne read it twice. She put it down on the table. Saren was looking out the window at the river. Eli had his hands in his pockets. "He doesn't know we're doing this," Saren said. Her voice was even and quiet. "He's never known, he's never wanted to know. We started putting this together 4 years ago. I did the document research. Eli did the financial structure. He thinks we're just running a machine parts distribution company." She stopped. "He's still in Brantford. He still fixes things for people. He still drives the same truck." She looked at Vivienne. "He spent 20 years making sure we had somewhere to wake up in the morning. We spent the last 8 making sure that when this day came, it was legal and it was documented and it would hold." Vivienne stood with that for a moment. She had a client. She was representing Douglas Reinhold. She had a retainer agreement and a professional obligation and a file that had been proceeding without incident. If she presented this clause in the next negotiation session, Douglas would withdraw from the deal and he would have cause to file a complaint against her personally. She thought about Wendy Sharp and what she had said about disclosure obligations under new ownership. She thought about a foundry in Sault Ste. Marie. She thought about Davon Okafor on his porch in the afternoon, reading a file he had read 1,000 times inside his own head, handing it back to her without expression. She rode the elevator down and stood outside on Dalhousie Street for a while. The Grand River was dark now. The light had gone all the way. The boardroom at the Hamilton Law Office had been booked for closing negotiations for 6 weeks. It was a large room with a long table and glass walls on one side and a credenza along the back, with catering on it that nobody was touching. Douglas Reinhold sat at the head of the table on his side with 2 legal counsel and 2 members of his board. The Sim side had Eli, Saren, and Vivienne, who had positioned herself 1 chair removed from Eli with her own folio, closed in front of her. Eli formally tabled the non-financial clause. The sheet went around the table. Douglas read it and set it down. He said, "This is a transaction, Mr. Sims, not a public apology tour. You can remove this clause or you can remove yourselves from this process." Vivienne stood up. She said, clearly, and for the record, that she was withdrawing as counsel for the vendor effective immediately due to a material conflict that had become known to her through the course of due diligence. She placed on the center of the table a USB drive with a single folder containing the scanned internal incident report from February 2007 and the OHSA refusal filing from 9 days prior, both properly sourced through discoverable channels. Douglas's face went a particular kind of still. One of the board members, a man named Rupert Ainsley who had been on the Reinhold board for 11 years and had the look of someone who had seen a version of this day coming for some time, reached across the table and picked up the drive. He looked at Douglas. Douglas said nothing. Rupert plugged the drive into his laptop. He read without expression for several minutes. He passed the laptop to the board member on his left. Saren stood up. She picked up the sheet with the 3-item clause. She read the first paragraph of Douglas's internal report aloud in the same clear, level voice she had used to walk through the financials at the first meeting, with the same absence of performance, just the words themselves, laid out in order. When she reached the finding, unresolved design flaw in the secondary pressure coupling, Millwright's formal safety refusal on file 9 days prior, she put the page down. She did not say anything further. Douglas looked at his two lawyers. Neither of them looked at him. Rupert Ainsley said, "Douglas, we need to step out." The Reinhold side left the room. The door closed. Eli did not move. Saren did not move. Vivian sat down. 17 minutes later, the Reinhold side came back in. Rupert sat down in Douglas's chair. Douglas did not return to the room. The acquisition closed 4 weeks later, at the original price, with the non-financial clause intact, and added as a schedule to the final agreement. The renamed company would be called Sims Okafor Manufacturing. The public acknowledgement would be published on the company website on the day of close. Rupert Ainsley had recommended the name change himself. Douglas had not objected to anything in writing. The Brantford Expositor ran the story on a Thursday morning. The reporter was not Duncan Chow, who had retired, but she called him for comment, and he said he had written the 2007 story expecting it to go somewhere, and had been told by his editor at the time that it was thin. He said thin in the tone of someone who had been thinking about that word for a long time. The Expositor piece named Davin Okafor in the second paragraph. By evening it had been picked up by the Hamilton Spectator and by the CBC Ontario Regional Desk. A retired millwright from Brantford named Carl left a tin of butter tarts on the porch at Elgin Street on Thursday afternoon, with a card that said, in pencil, that he had worked the same floor as Davin in 2003 and had known part of it and had not said so at the time. And he was sorry, and the tarts were from his wife who baked when she did not know what else to do. Carl did not knock. By the following morning there were 2 more items on the porch. A jar of preserves from a woman Davin did not immediately recognize. A folded note from someone who had left Brantford in 2009 and had found the address through a neighbor. Davin went to the garage that Thursday morning at the same time he always did. He had a lawnmower engine to reassemble for the man 3 houses down. He was partway through it when Margie from the bakery on Colborne Street came around the side of the house in her apron and flour still on her forearms and put both arms around him without a word. He stood still and let her. Through the garage window, he could see the street and the ordinary morning continuing. A woman with a stroller, a delivery truck. The light coming in through the maple on the front lawn. Vivian drove to Brantford that afternoon. She parked on the street and came up the laneway, and he was at the bench putting the lawnmower engine back together. He set the socket wrench on the bench when he heard her come in. He looked at her without particular surprise. She held out an envelope with the company letterhead on it. He took it. He read it standing at the bench. The transaction had closed. The non-financial clause had been honored in full. His name would appear on the company website by end of day. He was invited, as a guest of honor, to a small press conference at the facility the following Tuesday. The letter used "we were wrong" in the first paragraph. He folded the letter into thirds and set it on the workbench beside the calipers. He looked at her. "Do you want to stay for coffee?" She said yes. They sat on the porch. It was October, and the maples along Elgin Street turned the color of old copper, and the light came in low and flat across the front yard. Neither of them said much for a while. Vivienne said that she had left Court and Neil the previous week. She said she had taken a small office on Colborne Street, 4 blocks from where they were sitting. She said she was going to take labor cases, people who needed representation, and could not afford the rate she had been charging. She said she had been thinking about what to call the practice. He waited. She said she wanted to call it Okafor labor if he was willing. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once, the same way Eli had nodded at 9 years old at the kitchen table, deciding to believe something. His phone rang. He looked at the screen. Eli was calling on video 3-way with Saren. Eli was in his office on Dalhousie Street, standing at the window with his jacket off. He said the new signage had gone up on the building that morning, and he had been inside the plant for the first time as its owner. And it had felt, he said, like something he did not have the right word for. Saren was in a car somewhere, laughing, and said she was on her way and was stopping at Margie's for tarts, and that Devon should not eat anything until she got there. She said this with the authority of someone who had been issuing this instruction since she was 6 years old and had never once had it followed. Davin said he wasn't making any promises. The call ended. He set the phone on the porch railing. He had not talked much during the call. He had listened. He had asked one practical question about the signage installation and whether it was level, and Eli had laughed and said of course it was level, and Davin had said he would be the judge of that on Tuesday. The porch went quiet. The maples moved very slightly in a wind that was just beginning. Somewhere at the end of the street a car started and pulled away. Vivian was looking at the trees. Her coffee was going cold. His was too. He did not look at her when he spoke. 18 years ago, he said, I drove 2 kids home in the middle of February in a truck that needed a new alternator. I didn't think there was any version of things that looked like this afternoon. She did not answer right away. She watched the light move across the boards of the porch. Her hand was resting on the arm of the metal chair. His hand was on the arm of the other one, about a chair width apart. The maples kept moving. The street stayed quiet. Neither of them said the thing they did not need to say yet.